Welcome to this module, an introduction to adoption and permanency, developed by the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work, in partnership with the University of Vermont Department of Social Work. After a brief introduction, we will be learning about some of the history of adoption as it has been practiced in the United States, and the ways in which these practices have shaped current adoption and permanency practices. We will then learn about the many people who are touched by adoption as part of the Adoption Kinship Network, sometimes called the Adoption Constellation. Finally, we will close this module by reflecting on some of the ethical tensions and considerations that are a part of permanency and adoption practice. We will begin by introducing some of the terms and concepts of adoption and permanency. First, we will define the terms adoption and permanency. Then, we will talk about the different types of adoption that exist. What is adoption? Adoption is the legal and physical transfer of a child from one family to another. In child welfare, adoption is often referred to as permanency, or one of the permanency options for children in foster care. In the child welfare context, adoption is one type of permanency. Other types of permanency can include reunification with birth parents, legal guardianship. According to the Federal Adoption and Safe Families Act, ASFA, permanency options include reunification with birth parents, transfer of permanent legal and physical custody, also commonly called legal guardianship, adoption, including customary adoption, a form of adoption practiced by some American Indian tribal communities, permanent placement with a relative, or another planned permanent living arrangement, or APPLA, APLA. Most states place their primary focus on reunification and adoption. In the United States, there are several types of adoptions. Step-parent adoptions. This is the adoption of a child by a biological parent's spouse or partner. The non-custodial biological parent must relinquish parental rights for a step-parent to legally adopt a stepchild. Private independent adoptions. This type of adoption typically involves an infant, often placed at birth or soon after, through a direct agreement from the biological parent or parents to adoptive parent or parents. Depending on the state, private adoptions may be facilitated by an adoption agency, or they may be independently facilitated by an adoption attorney or an adoption facilitator. Foster care adoption. Foster care adoption involves children who were removed from their biological parents or caregivers because of abuse or neglect. Inter-country adoption. This is a type of private adoption involving a child born or residing in a foreign country. Depending on the sending country, or the country currently regulating and caring for the child, they may reside in an orphanage, group home, foster home, or with relatives until the adoption is processed. Those eligible to adopt a child include a step-parent, a relative or extended family member, such as a grandparent, a child's foster parent, a person who is unrelated to the child. Most adoptions involve an existing relationship with the child. We use the term new resource parent to refer to a prospective adoptive parent who has not had a previous relationship with the child being placed for adoption. Adoption and permanency involve confusing systems. As previously mentioned, there are different types of adoptions, step-parent, foster care, intercountry, and private adoptions, that operate as separate silos. We will discuss some of these silos next. Some adoption systems are highly regulated, such as public foster care adoption. Public foster care adoption is governed by the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, ACYF, an arm of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Federal laws provide standards for permanency and adoption practice. State-level policies and laws governing adoption can also be established. States are required to annually report data about children adopted from their foster care system to the Children's Bureau, an office of the ACYF. For inter-country adoptions, oversight of the process is managed through several entities. The Hague Convention on Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Inter-Country Adoption provides ethical standards and guidelines in the adoption of children across international borders. As part of the Hague Convention, each country must have a central authority. In addition, the country in which the adopted child resides has its own governing and regulatory agency, often part of one of the sending country's government departments. The Department of State is the central authority for the United States, governing immigration and naturalization. The private independent adoption system is highly unregulated and relies on the good faith efforts of those participating within that system. States may have some laws and policies governing private independent adoptions. Most of these regulations focus on the amount of money prospective adoptive parents can financially reimburse expectant birth parents for pregnancy-related costs, and policies about sharing private identifying information. What might be the benefits and what might be the challenges of the U.S. having these multiple systems of adoption? Adoption, as it is known today, is a relatively new phenomenon based on European and American legal and cultural definitions of family. Other cultures have different views about adoption. Some do not believe it is possible to emotionally or socially terminate parental rights. However, other societies and cultures practice their own forms of substitute child care if a parent is unable or unwilling to parent. It is important to consider the ways these practices have influenced and shaped current adoption and permanency practices by examining the history of adoption in the United States. Responses to children without parents have varied. Historically, children's placements have included boarding and indenture, religious institutions, orphanages and asylums, baby farms, orphan trains, Native American boarding schools, foster homes, adoptive homes. When examining some of these placement responses and historical periods in more depth, it is important to remember that eras overlap. From the mid-1800s through the 1920s, there was a growing understanding that children were vulnerable. During the Progressive Era in the United States, a concern about child protection and safety emerged. At the same time, child placement was as much about, quote, civilizing and assimilating what many thought were troublesome ethnic populations as it was about child protection. Prior to the mid-1800s, children were valued for their economic contribution to the family, not for their emotional contributions. Children were not seen as a vulnerable population needing protection. Children were seen as little adults and expected to work at a young age. It was a common practice to place children with extended relatives, particularly when families were poor. Child labor laws to protect children from being exploited and exposed to harsh working conditions were not fully passed until 1938. In fact, there were no laws that protected the physical safety of children until the case of 10-year-old Mary Ellen Wilson in 1874. Because there were no child abuse laws, animal cruelty laws were used to argue for Mary Ellen's removal and protection from the extreme physical and emotional abuse inflicted by her adoptive parents. Children would sometimes be loaned out to other families where they would work in exchange for room and board. These placements were economical, not placing a child for affection and nurturance. Sometimes parents would place children within religious institutions, particularly churches, where they would work in exchange for room and board. Baby farms, in which parents could pay a fee to have someone else take their infant, operated in the U.S. until around the 1920s. Sociologist Viviana Zelizer reports that the mortality rate reached 85 to 90% at some baby farms. Orphanages and asylums became popular options in the 1800s and early 1900s. While children's asylums and orphanages were a system of handling large numbers of children in poverty, the term orphanage has always been a misleading way to describe institutional care for children, since the majority of children in orphanages had one or more living parents who were unable to care for them, usually because of issues of poverty. Orphanages were thought to be a model of efficiently caring for large numbers of children. Asylums and orphanages were always intended to be temporary placements, where children could get their basic needs met until family could establish financial stability. In the mid-1800s, particularly in urban cities like New York, the influx of immigrants led to an overflow of children homeless or placed in orphanages. Concerned humanitarians began to look for ways to reduce the number of poor children left to fend for themselves. The orphan train movement was one such project. Hundreds of thousands of children were sent by train from big urban cities in the East and placed in foster and adoptive families in farming communities from 1853 to 1929. The phrase, put up for adoption, comes from children being put up on train platforms for adults to choose from them to foster or adopt. Charles Loring Brace, a Presbyterian minister who founded the New York Children's Aid Society, started the orphan train movement. Brace targeted children from immigrant populations that he viewed as unfit or dangerous and documented his views in his book, The Dangerous Classes of New York. He wrote, Thousands are the children of poor foreigners who have permitted them to grow up without school, education, or religion. All the neglect and bad education and evil example of a poor class tend to form others, who, as they mature, swell the ranks of ruffians and criminals, who become the dangerous class of our city. Social workers were largely responsible for ending the orphan train movement, whose concerns about the treatment of children in these placements included a lack of home studies and follow-up on how the children were faring. Social workers were also focused on prevention, with assistance to children and families through supports like the mother's pensions for widows so they could afford to keep their children. The majority of the children placed from the orphan trains were not legally adopted. Most children were indentured and chosen to work for families looking for older children who would be able to help economically, which is why few babies and infants were placed on orphan trains. The orphan train movement was one way that the United States attempted to assimilate children from populations thought to be un-American. The Native American boarding schools were another way. While orphanages were being dismantled in favor of fostering, indenture, and adoption, the boarding schools continued to grow and spread around the country for Indian children. Beginning in the mid-1800s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools run by the government or religious institutions. At the boarding schools, children were prohibited from wearing traditional clothing or hairstyle. They were punished for speaking tribal languages or practicing their spiritual traditions. They were forced to have anglicized names. Assimilation weakened Indian communities by ensuring future generations would not be able to continue their language, traditions, customs, spiritual practices, and governance. Many children were abused and neglected in the boarding schools, and most experienced trauma. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, the military leader who opened the first boarding school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, stated, "If you kill the Indian in the child, you save the man." Boarding schools no longer cared for children once they reached their 18th birthday. Some tried to return to their tribal communities, but were unable to speak the language and had forgotten their customs. Many had trouble reintegrating back into their tribal communities, and yet, despite their assimilation, were still discriminated against by European Americans because of their race. The Native American community still struggles with the lasting effects of the widespread removal of their children, and call this practice of assimilation programs cultural genocide. It is now understood that these systematic practices within the boarding schools have resulted in generational trauma passed down through families and communities. Around the same time the orphan trains were running, there were other efforts to increase fostering and adoption. One of the most public efforts was the Delineator magazine's Child Rescue Campaign. From 1907 to 1911, the popular women's magazine wrote monthly articles about adoption and featured profiles of children. The Child Rescue Campaign uniquely posed adoption as not merely a solution to a social problem, but as a way to fulfill women's emotional needs of motherhood. In October 1907, the magazine published a story titled "The Child Without a Home," and the story appealed to the compassionate reader. The story stated, "Deprived of a mother's love, they were a potential threat to society." A particular adoption article noted that women had the future of society in their hands through raising good citizens. 300 women wrote to the editor requesting to adopt the children profiled in the story. The Delineator popularized the use of the child profile that is still commonly used today to describe children waiting for adoption. In the aftermath of the Great Depression and the end of World War II, new values about adoption emerged. In 1938, the Child Welfare League of America began publishing their Standards for Adoption Practice to help social workers and child welfare professionals consider best practices in adoption. An increase in family building after World War II led to a greater interest in adoption, as couples unable to conceive biological children turned to adoption. Adoption was seen as a means to build a family, instead of a way to rescue children, and as a solution to infertility. An emphasis was placed on matching infants to physically and intellectually resemble their adoptive parents. This practice was believed beneficial because adoption still carried social stigma for both the child and the adoptive parents. Since the majority of adoption agencies catered to middle-class, married, white couples who were challenged by infertility, the demand for adoptable infants was high. Children of ethnic minority communities, children with disabilities, or those who were older were considered unadoptable. As historian Ellen Herman wrote, by matching children to parents, Physical resemblance, intellectual similarity, and racial and religious continuity between parents and children were preferred goals in adoptive families, so that it appeared a biological relationship, erasing the child's former history. Other adoption practices that promoted similar beliefs about adoption as a replacement for a biological family include sealing adoption records and original birth certificates, de-identifying information about the child's biological family, issuing amended birth certificates with the adoptive parent's name as biological parents, and the practice of closed adoptions, where biological parents did not have future access to the child they placed for adoption. Maternity homes were originally created as a rehabilitative resource for unmarried pregnant women. Most maternity homes were operated by religious organizations as a place where unmarried pregnant women would receive parenting and job training skills so they could support and parent their child. Adoption was not the preferred option for women in maternity homes until social work professionals began to staff and manage the homes. According to Regina Kunzel, a historian of the maternity home era, whereas unmarried pregnant women were previously seen as victims of unscrupulous men, now the victims were the children of sexually immoral women. This perspective helped propagate negative views about birth parents. Anne Fessler's book documenting first-hand accounts of women's experiences in maternity homes reveals deep feelings of shame, stigma, and pain. Many of the women felt they had no choice but to place their child for adoption because of their families and communities. A number of racial and cultural considerations are important to understand. While matching children in adoption was the practice, there were some notable exceptions. Native American children were still actively removed from their families and placed into boarding schools, experiencing forcible assimilation. The Child Welfare League of America additionally created the Indian Adoption Project, a program that placed Native American children with white adoptive families, also for the purpose of assimilation. The project ran from 1958 to 1967, placing nearly 400 children. Intercountry, also known as international or transnational adoptions, began right after World War II. The first children adopted to the U.S. were from Germany, Greece, and Japan. The next groups of children adopted internationally were from South Korea in the 1950s and Taiwan and Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. Many African American and other ethnic minority children and families were excluded from mainstream adoption and permanency services. In the 1950s, the National Urban League created a program called Adopt a Child, reaching out to Black and Puerto Rican communities for adoption. At the same time, some white families began to seek adoption of children of color. The first documented transracial adoption of a black child into a white family occurred in 1948 in Minnesota. Starting in the 1950s, widespread social activism such as the civil rights, feminist, and disability rights movements began to impact attitudes and practices in adoption and permanency. The focus on protecting children once again emerged when Dr. Henry Kemp wrote The Battered Child Syndrome in 1962. His book garnered attention toward child abuse, and as a result, foster care placements increased as many more children were removed from abusive and neglectful homes. The placement of children with disabilities into institutional care was challenged during this time period as well, as parents began to advocate for support to raise their children. A 1972 expose of Willowbrook State School in New York revealed the abusive and horrific living conditions in institutions, prompting deinstitutionalization. The impact of Roe v. Wade, along with the availability of birth control and a lessened stigma on single motherhood, led to a decrease in the number of infants placed for adoption. The civil rights movement also influenced adoption. As a response to the Native American boarding schools and the Indian Adoption Project, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 was passed to allow tribes jurisdiction over placement of Native American children. The National Association of Black Social Workers advocated against transracial adoption of black children into white homes in a 1972 position statement. Women who were residents in maternity homes formed a group called Concerned United Birth Mothers, CUB, to support other birth parents who had lost children through adoption. Since the 1980s, there have been significant shifts in how we view and practice adoptions. There has been an increased focus on special needs adoptions. Special needs includes characteristics that may hinder a child's adoption, such as age, race, disability, or membership within a sibling group. The term hard to place was changed to special needs in order to lessen the belief that some children were unadoptable. Federal incentives, such as adoption subsidies, were created to help increase the adoption of children with special needs. Special attention has also been focused around prioritizing keeping siblings together in placement. Historically, it was common to place siblings in separate adoptive homes. Recognition that it is traumatic for children to be separated from their siblings has led to a greater priority to keep siblings together. By the 1990s, it was recognized that too many children were in foster care drift, meaning they were lingering in foster care and often remaining until they turned 18, never returning to their families or being adopted. Laws prioritizing permanency were passed to reduce foster care drift and to provide children with greater security and sense of family. Concerns about the outcomes of children aging out of foster care without permanency also contributed a greater emphasis on permanency. Along with the change in thinking about what makes a child adoptable, there has been an expansion in thinking about what kind of parent should be allowed to adopt. Adoptive parents in the past had to be a married, heterosexual couple without any disabilities. Today, persons who are single, identify as LGBTQ, or with disabilities are adopting children. Some prospective parents still experience discrimination in the adoption process. Since the 1980s, transracial adoptions have been increasingly common. Since 1994, federal laws have prohibited child welfare agencies from delaying or denying the placement of children in foster care for adoption based on race. These laws do not apply to private adoptions. However, many children are adopted transracially through private adoptions. From the 1980s until 2004, the numbers of intercountry adoptions grew at high rates when over 22,000 children were adopted to the U.S., but then began to decline due to a number of factors. Since the 1930s, the belief and practice around adoption was to preserve privacy and secrecy. In the past few decades, there has been a significant change in this view. More and more, transparency and openness is being practiced in adoption. There has been an increase in birth parents choosing to have open adoption relationships with their child and adoptive parents. Adopted individuals have also led activism around unsealing adoption and original birth records. Other, more recent areas of concern include placement stability. Families may struggle after an adoption finalization, particularly when having adopted a child who has experienced trauma. Consequently, some families experience placement instability. Adoption disruption is when the adoption relationship between child and adoptive parents ends after the placement has occurred, but before the adoption has been finalized in court. Adoption displacement occurs when a child is removed from the home after the finalization, but the adoptive parents still retain parental rights. For example, the child might be placed in a residential treatment center to receive intensive services. Adoption dissolution is when the adoptive parents terminate their parental rights and the child enters foster care or is adopted by another family. Today, there is much more recognition that adoptive families need competent post-adoption support. In summary, the practice of adoption today is different in some ways than it has been in the past, yet some aspects remain the same or similar. Although lessons have been learned and practice improvements have been implemented, there remain opportunities for growth throughout the permanency and adoption process. Given what you have learned so far in this module, reflect on the following questions. What information about the history of adoption was new for you? What do you think has been the biggest change in how adoption is practiced today? What current practices do you think might surprise future generations of child welfare professionals? With this historical overview, we will now turn our attention to understanding how we conceptualize individual roles within the adoption permanency process. When considering the primary client during an adoption, practitioners have different opinions and views about the main target. Is it the child's biological family, or the adoptive family? Other complicating factors may include additional people who should be included and how much weight to give various perspectives. For a long time, the prevailing model of the people involved in an adoption was understood as the Adoption Triad, in which the child, birth parents, and adoptive parents were thought of as the 3 points of a triangle. There have been some criticisms of this model, including the concern it leaves out other people and communities affected by an adoption. In addition to birth and adoptive parents, extended family members such as grandparents, aunts and uncles, and cousins have relationships to the adopted child. The adopted child also might have siblings, both biological and adoptive. The triad model can be seen as a closed system that leaves out important people and communities in an adopted child's life. The adoption triad often suggests an equilateral triangle, yet not all of the parties to the triad have equal power or say, and therefore the triad might be more accurately represented as a scalene triangle. It may be perceived that some members of the triad have more power than others. More recently, alternative concepts to the adoption triad have been created. Researchers Hal Grodevant and Ruth McRoy coined the term adoption kinship network to describe all of the people and communities influenced by an adoption. Michael Grand, a psychologist based in Canada, uses the concept of an adoption constellation. Such inclusive terms describe the expansive, additive nature of adoption that counters a subtractive, closed, and fixed view of adoption as a triad. Given this discussion of power and role, it is important to discuss ethical considerations in permanency and adoption, and how our own personal and professional experiences may shape our current views and opinions about adoption and permanency. Take a moment and consider, what personal and/or professional experiences have shaped how you view permanency and adoption? One of the difficulties in adoption and permanency work is balancing multiple needs, goals, interests, and clients. There is a saying that adoption is about finding families for children, not children for families. However, the reality of adoption and permanency work is that the focus often does become about meeting the needs of prospective adoptive parents. Consider, do you think adoption is about finding families for children or finding children for families? What have you seen or experienced in your practice that has highlighted this tension? As previously discussed, adoption is practiced in silos. This means that home study requirements and pre-adoption training and preparation expectations are different from state to state, making interjurisdictional adoption cases confusing and potentially vulnerable to poor and unethical practices. In addition to the inconsistent regulation of adoption across differing adoption and permanency systems, there is also a void of information due to the lack of a national repository of adoption data. Little other than general numbers of adopted children from the 2000 and 2010 census is known about adopted children and adoptive families. The only regularly collected data comes from the Children's Bureau because, as mentioned earlier, states are required to provide data on foster care adoptions. The U.S. Department of State collects data only on the yearly number of visas given to children entering the U.S. for adoption and the number of children that left the U.S. to be adopted by families in other countries. The number of children adopted through private independent adoption or by a step-parent is recorded by individual family court districts in each state, and the data is kept at the district level. Take a moment and reflect. What do you think are the consequences of the separate types of adoption systems and lack of cohesive data for permanency practice? How might these silos affect adoptive families? Finally, there are many other factors surrounding adoption that child welfare professionals still struggle with. For example, it is challenging to balance what parents want and need, as well as the child's needs and best interests. Should adoptive parents get to specify the type of child they want to adopt? Should children be able to have a say in who adopts them? At what age should a child be able to have a say in what their best interests are? Another consideration is who should regulate permanency in adoption? The government? Social work professionals? Attorneys? Private facilitators? Is there a need for more consistency across types of adoptions and nationally? An additional concern is the vastly disparate cost of adoption in different contexts. Unfortunately, in many ways, adoption has become a business. This slide from a 2009-2010 Adoptive Families Survey shows the differences in the average cost to adopt a child based on type of adoption. Children in foster care, many of whom are racial minorities, older children, or part of sibling groups, that is, those with, quote, special needs, have the lowest fees to adopt. With adoption subsidies and reimbursements, it may cost an adoptive parent little to legalize the adoption of a child from foster care. Step-parents have to pay for associated legal fees to finalize the adoption, but unless there are legal issues regarding obtaining a termination of parental rights or consent to adopt by the non-custodial parent, the fees are relatively minimal. Once a family chooses domestic or international adoption, however, they will pay anywhere from $10,000 to upwards of $50,000 or more per child. Associated fees for adopting children through domestic adoption may be less if the child is Black, biracial, or has a disability. There are also lower fees for internationally adopting an older child or one with special needs. Social work and child welfare ethics protect children, and yet the concern remains about how to reconcile the difference in fees for adoption. We have looked at historical practices of adoption to consider how past practices and perspectives have shaped current ways of thinking. We also defined adoption and permanency as currently practiced, and who is impacted by adoption. Finally, we explored ethical tensions that make adoption challenging, such as balancing multiple clients, their needs, and conflicting best interests. More information on many of the topics covered today can be referenced in the resource list. Thank you for participating in today's module on adoption and permanency.